We're now gonna move on to our first session, um, which is going to be facilitated by Arena, from the IDG, one of our key partners working in the T20, as part of the steering committee there. And we're gonna be just discussing, in light of the dynamics in international reform at the UN and with South Africa hosting the G20 and the presidency, what are some of the opportunities and challenges for Africa as a continent that we can use to advance our agenda? And what does that agenda look like? And Arena will be speaking with Chennai from the Tax Justice Network. I'll leave her to introduce Chennai. But we were, just to say apologies, we were supposed to be joined by two guests online, Joel as well as Ashraf, who have other commitments at the moment. And so and then Zwelinzi Mavavi, the General Secretary, the General Secretary of SAF 2, couldn't join us this morning. So we'll have Chennai and we'll just use this space as really an open discussion to delve deeper into the work that the TGNA has done in Africa, in coordinating partners, and get some more insights into how we can use the opportunities for this year. Over to you, Arena.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this incredible summit and conference. And I'm absolutely excited to see what we come up with. I'd really appreciate if Chennai Mukumba could please join me on stage. And I think we'll just have a seat and just engage like that. So let me have a seat. All right. So what we're really looking at with the session is to set the tone of what the global discussions are really about, how Africa is really impacted, and at the crux of the issue, when many people think about tax, it sounds like a very ugly word, right? But it has a lot of practical applications, and we are supposed to see a lot of the impact in our daily lives. And so the session we were going to discuss the ongoing efforts on international tax reform, the challenges, the opportunities, what they present for African countries specifically, especially with the trends that we're going to see over the next 10 to 25 years and how African countries are going to be impacted severely, and the actions that they should take to use. It will also touch on opportunities surrounding the UN Tax Convention, illicit financial flows as well. Sorry, the digital economy and how that is supposed to also play a very fundamental role in African socioeconomics. And at the end of the day, what is the kind of responsibility surrounding global multilateral bodies like your G20, like your broader UN engagements, in the reality where we have a dwindling faith in the prospects of multilateralism and how we all are able to pull collectively together? So coming to my speaker, my illustrious speaker, I'm actually incredibly appreciative that we have this time together. I've been looking at some of the work that you've done at AU level, on the topics of illicit financial flows, and I'm absolutely excited to hear what you have to say today. But Chennai Mukumba is the executive director at Tax Justice Network Africa, based in Nairobi, Kenya, providing strategic leadership and direction to deliver the TJNA's mission and vision. And Chennai has a master's in international relations from WITS and a master's in taxation from the University of Oxford. So to kick us off, I'm not going to ask the world from you, I'm sorry. It's a very loaded kind of moment. But what is the importance of UN Tax Convention or the UN Tax Convention for African countries today? And what is going to be the importance in the next 10 years?
Thank you so much, Arena, and good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. We are very excited and honored to be here. I'm joined by one of my colleagues who will be talking in the next session. As mentioned, I work for Tax Justice Network Africa, which is a civil society organization that works as a research and advocacy institution. We are based in Namibia and operate as a network. So we are essentially a secretariat for close to 50 civil society organizations across the continent that work on different issues, but see the importance of tax in contributing to their agenda. So, for example, we have women's rights organizations that are members of TJNA that are increasingly starting to see that if they're not paying attention to tax conversations, in a way that can serve to undermine some of their other objectives as well. So that's a bit about TJNA, the way we operate, and essentially where we're based. As was mentioned, we essentially work to advocate for tax justice with a big focus on curbing illicit financial flows. Why illicit financial flows? The reason is because when you're talking about illicit financial flows, these are resources that were already generated, right, within an economy, within a country. And so we're having conversations about how to close the loopholes that essentially cause the loss of those resources, right? And so that's what the illicit financial flows discussion is about. And the way in which this connects to the discussion on the UN Tax Convention is because in order to curb the loss of these resources from African countries, you need to enhance international tax cooperation. In 2015, most of you will know, there was a report that was published that was focusing on illicit financial flows on the continent and what we needed to do as countries in order to curb these resources. So this was essentially put out by the high-level panel report, by the high-level panel that was chaired by His Excellency Thabo Mbeki. Now, what this report did is highlight that there were sort of three different layers that we needed to look at in order to curb illicit financial flows. At the national level, what the report recommended was, for example, we needed to strengthen our tax administrations. We needed to put in place, for example, transfer pricing units, all of these different things that we needed to do to strengthen our domestic efforts. At the regional level, what the report indicated was that we needed to improve regional coordination, right, in order to address things like harmful tax competition and other areas that various multinational corporations were exploiting, right, in order to contribute to illicit financial flows. And then thirdly, what the report identified was that there needed to be enhanced international tax cooperation as well. Essentially, what the report flagged was that you can do all this work at the national level, and one of our earlier speakers flagged this, but unless you're also taking a look at what exists within the international level, essentially that can serve to undermine your domestic efforts. And so essentially the UN Tax Convention conversation is to try and address that particular issue that was flagged by the high-level panel report. Now, why the UN Tax Convention, right? Because there is already conversations, there is already a place where discussions on global tax systems take place, right? Yet, despite that, the Africa Group in New York saw a need to see how we could shift that conversation from where it's currently taking place to New York, to the United Nations. Now, there's a number of different reasons for this. Firstly, it was a question of inclusivity. Currently, global tax rules are being developed at the OECD, particularly within the inclusive framework. Do African countries participate within that space? How many African countries are participating within that space? Those were the questions that the UN negotiators were questioning. At present, close to 50% of African countries are members of the inclusive framework, right? So there was a question of inclusivity. If we're not at the table, to what extent can we meaningfully contribute to what's coming out of those discussions? The second thing was that when you take a look at the OECD inclusive framework, there's a lot of reports that have come out to indicate that it's not really equal footing in the sense that there are certain countries that have more weight within negotiations than others, right? Now, the discussion about shifting that conversation from the OECD to the UN was on the premise that particularly within the General Assembly, it's one country, one vote, regardless of your income, regardless of your capacity. I remember participating in one of the sessions last year when the ad hoc committee was put together to determine the terms of reference of the UN Framework Convention. And I recall a moment when Lesotho actually raised its flag. And at that time, it was the Deputy Commissioner General of the Revenue Authority who was saying, this is the first time that I can contribute meaningfully to global tax rules and know that my voice will be heard, because at the end of the day, my vote counts as much as any other country in the room, right? And so that's one of the reasons for which the Africa Group decided that we needed to have a conversation at the UN. And then thirdly, part of the reason we have such a complex set of rules that govern our global tax system is because you haven't had countries that are able to meaningfully participate and reflect their specific needs within the conversation, right? So ultimately, if you have a small group of countries that are leading discussions and you've got a select group of countries that are really directing the way in which those engagements go, the ultimate outcome is going to be one that reflects their capacities, right? And so the extent to which you can shift those conversations to a much more democratic, a much more inclusive platform, you're then more likely to have outcomes that are reflective and cognizant of the needs of all countries, right? Is it easy? No. Is it messy? Yes. But the extent to which you have a result that's better for more countries is what makes it worth it, right? And so that's what the conversation about a UN tax convention has been, and why the impetus for this particular discussion.
Thank you for kicking us off like that. There are so many aspects that I want to touch on. And as you were closing off in terms of how African countries are able to have meaningful participation, links, to your non-tariff barriers, if I was to think of it in a trade kind of context, where the majority of African experts, you find them mostly in your IMF, your World Bank, your WTO, who have been seconded there because they have the most institutional memory, the most kind of expertise to engage on high levels on these kinds of platforms. But then what happens at national level? You have this kind of exodus of your expertise. And this is something that I'm sure slowly but surely, will be adjusted over time in order to create some kind of incremental gains. But in this situation where we have these multilateral ways of engaging, for example, at G20 level, if we can bring the conversation to G20 level, to what extent have you seen taxation be taken up by this premium negotiation body that is there to discuss economic reform? What are your thoughts around the G20's participation in that regard? And obviously, we believe it should be an issue that the G20 grapples with. But if we were to remind, the G20 will remind them, why should it be a G20 issue?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. So I think before responding to it directly, I want to give a little bit more of a context behind why this discussion on a UN tax convention is so important. One of the things that has been often said, for those of you who follow conversations on international relations, etc., is that the multilateral system is no longer fit for purpose, right? And this has been uttered even from, for example, the UN Secretary General himself, right, indicating that we find ourselves at a crisis point, right? Where essentially our international financial architecture is not working, particularly for the countries that need it most, right? And what we see right now with the UN Framework Convention is a glimmer of hope, right? In the sense that at a time where questions are being asked of all of these different platforms where various discussions happen, right? So, for example, the WTO and now the OECD, et cetera, you have a space that's being championed, particularly by African countries, the Global South group, right, to see how we can actually begin to create a platform that is inclusive, that works for everybody, right? And the reason I emphasize everybody is because there's been a bit of a narrative that, oh, this is just an African agenda, oh, this is just African countries trying to get a bigger piece of the pie. But really, it's a conversation about how everybody can benefit, because right now, the only people that benefit, particularly from a system that's being exploited by wealthy individuals and corporates, is the 1%, right? And so really, it's a big question about how can we create a multilateral system that is beneficial for all, right? And one of the ways of doing that is by democratizing it, right? And allowing everybody to have a say. And the reason this is important is because we want to create a system where you can't have a single actor or player or country hold everybody hostage, right? And I'm not going to go into the details of what that looked like, right, in the recent past. But to give a very specific example, at the beginning of this year, we had the first set of negotiations on the UN of the UN Tax Convention, and at that particular session, countries were really just sort of, speaking about their support for this work and what they were hoping was going to come out of these negotiations. On the afternoon of the first day, the United States walked out of the meeting and essentially said that the current discussions didn't align with their national interests. What happened next? Nothing. Negotiations continued. Countries continued to have discussions about what for them would make a multilateral system that works on tax beneficial for everybody. And the reason I flag that, right, is because the UN Framework Convention discussion now really can serve as a blueprint, right, for the way in which multilateralism can work. And we're actually starting to see this. 2 weeks ago in Togo, the Africa Union had a meeting where they were talking about our current Africa debt crisis, right? And so for our colleagues who work on debt, one of the big things that they've been calling for was a platform, is essentially a platform where both creditors and debtors can come together and equally sort of think through how to address this debt crisis, right? The common framework has been proven to not be as effective, right, as many countries would have hoped. One of the asks that came from that meeting, if you take a look at the outcome document, was a UN Convention on Sovereign Debt. And this is really drawing from what they've seen as a positive experience from the discussion on a UN Framework Convention on tax, right? Again, I say that the discussions happening on tax are not easy. You're seeing a lot of tensions, and you're seeing a lot of different countries pulling in different directions. But that's to be expected, right? Whenever you're seeing such a potential restructuring of power. But essentially, the reason I say that is because it pushes back against this narrative that multilateralism is no longer working, right? And that we essentially now need to look inwards and essentially take a self-interested approach. And so I think I want to flag that particular point. Now, speaking to G20, I think South Africa plays an important role, not just on the continent, right, but also within the G20 in the sense that it speaks on behalf of Africa, and now essentially is joined by the Africa Union as a member of the G20. I think here there is a lot of potential for the G20 to speak to the fact that multilateralism is working and that there is space, right, where essentially countries are able to come together collectively and make decisions in a way that benefits everybody. The reason I say this is because the G20 is a group of 20 countries, right, and 21 now when you think about the Africa Union. And what we've seen is the G20 recognize, for example, the conversations that are happening at the UN on the Framework Convention. But I think there's room for the G20 to actually support that, right? And use their weight, their power, their political prowess to advocate for a platform that is inclusive, right? For one that benefits all. So I think that's where there could be some intersection.
Thank you for that. Can I ask you to please start a podcast so I can just download and listen continuously? So I want to stay on this phenomenon of looking inwards, where we're going to see, well, we've seen a USA first approach by the US, and it's going to likely continue, not just for the Trump administration, but for the foreseeable future. I mean, people are talking 20, 25 years time until you're likely to see any kind of change in the US attitude. But that is more symptomatic of what is happening around the world, where you're seeing this inward focus, this hyper regionalization, and in a moment where economically you see shifting value chains essentially moving out of Africa, but Africa still being the consumer in this case, and not necessarily industrialization, not reaching its industrialization goals as it would have hoped to achieve. Here, I believe taxpayers play such an important role, especially in a progressive tax environment. But where we have a very inward-looking scenario, right, where, say, the rest of the world is doing much of the same, we're not going to be able, in the worst-case scenario, make too many inroads on the UN Tax Convention. What should African countries be doing to set an example for the world?
I think they have already begun to set an example, right? I think the fact that this conversation on a UN tax convention is being led by the Africa group is unprecedented, right? When you speak to some of the negotiators that were in the room in 2022 when the first resolution was passed, many countries were shocked, right, that this was even a proposal, and then secondly, that it got through. So I think in that sense, Africa is already leading the way. And I say Africa, but there's support from the global South generally, right? You're seeing support, for example, when you take a look at the way countries are voting from Latin America, from SIDS, and even from Asia, right? So I think we're seeing a reform agenda that's being propelled by global South countries. Again, I always say this: it sounds easier, right, than it actually is, but it's not. And the reason for that is because we're not a homogenous region, right, as a global South country. So there are tensions there, but ultimately it is being pushed by the global South. And then I think to your agenda, I mean to your question, for us as a continent, we really need to be thinking about how we can use not just tax, but all of these other various sort of economic tools that are at our disposal to push for our structural agenda, right? To push for our structural transformation. That should be ideally how we are thinking about it. Because you are right, at present we find ourselves consuming goods that are being produced elsewhere. We find ourselves at the bottom of value chains, right? And that needs to be turned on its head, right? If we want to see the economic development and economic transformation that we see, and tax can play a very, very big role in contributing to that, alongside, like I say, all of these other economic tools at our disposal.
Thank you. And I think at this point, I want to open it up to the floor for questions and comments and a bit more robust engagement, if you'd like to make a contribution as well. But while we wait for some hands, I want to think a little bit about, at the end of the day, the hope was to create, well, at the end of today's summit, noting on the program, the hope is to create a kind of advocacy strategy to take this forward. Now, if we were to target someone specifically, who should move the needle? How should they move the needle?
I think that's a really good question. I would say there are different components of the South African government, right? And so because of that, I think you require different conversations with different groups. I'm not best placed to do that. We've got incredible colleagues, IEJ and AIDC, that are doing that work. But I think one of the things we found is that there seems to be a bit of a disconnect between, for example, your foreign office versus your treasury, right? And so because of that, I think there needs to be a conversation about how to smallen my English is finished now, to reduce that gap, right? Because at times we in our engagement with various South African officials have seen sort of different responses to this conversation on a UN tax convention. And I think it's because, South Africa, as was mentioned before, in its inequality straddles, right, sort of almost different identities in different spaces. And so I think the question on who to speak to and how to move that needle really should be given by the partners on the ground that are, talking to the different stakeholders. But I think by and large, what we would ideally want to see is a much more explicit support, right, on this UN Framework Convention, because as I said earlier, it's much bigger than just the tax conversation. It's a conversation about how to reform and upend, right, a global system that's underpinned by sort of colonial pillars, right, that was put in place when many of our countries, some of us weren't even in existence at that time, right? And so I see this as the beginning of what's going to be a very long transformative agenda for us, for the global economy as a whole. And South Africa has a very big part to play because, as I mentioned, it's straddling different spaces and can almost identify with different regions, and so should be in a position to help sort of reduce that gap.
I'll go around the room. Do we have a roving mic available, perhaps? I see a question in the middle there. Just raise your hand, and one at the back. Just please introduce yourself, your name, where you're from, and then you can start with your question. Thank you.
Morning, comrades. I'm Tanya van Meerlis. I'm from Cosatu. Thanks very much for the very informative input. I have a question around how governments are engaging at UN level. So I take your point very strongly that it's one country, one vote, and that does democratize things. But we also know, for example, that if you take a USA and the huge amount of resources they've got to send people to the UN and research and just drive their participation compared to some countries in Africa where we just don't have those resources. Do you see that playing out in the UN and in the discussions on taxation specifically? And what can we do as unions, as progressives, as civil society to try and further empower and embolden many of the smaller countries who would take a more progressive view so that they can engage effectively and use the space that's open? That's the one thing. The second thing, and you said something interesting earlier on around the engagements are difficult because there is a contestation around power. How do you see the countries falling now as the debates are taking place? So where are countries broadly lining up, and how would one be able to shift those positions if at all it's possible? Thanks.
Morning. Hello. I'm Russell Rensburg. I'm from the Rural Health Advocacy Project, and we run a small health tax alliance. It was our first entry into the revenue side of the budget in South Africa. And I think one of the difficulties around taxation is it's incredibly complex and layered, right? So developing an advocacy strategy around taxation needs some definitional clarity and approach, right? So one of the first things is, what is a just taxation system? Is that something that we can all agree on, right? So that as we build our strategies from our various sectors, we work towards the same goal. The second thing is this issue of trade, right? And how it complicates discussions around tax and tax incentives, particularly in our continent where we're underdeveloped, right? I think multinationals exploit it. And the result is that we have this whole race to the bottom on competing for housing some of these multinationals. Again, we need some definitional clarity on what is the counter narrative. Then in our own region here, we have Mauritius, right? Which is increasingly being marketed, firstly, as a member of SANEC. They benefit from some of the concessions of being within the regional unit, but at the same time also exploit the regional unit by creating an environment for tax avoidance. So this issue is incredibly complex, but I think what our experience with health taxes, though, was to focus on the problem that we try and solve and less on the taxation, right? And the tax should fuel, or the tax for health at least, should be leveled to solve a problem. So in health, it's about reducing demand for tobacco, alcohol, and sugar. But the narrative is not about the tax. It's about the impact that the use of those products have on current health costs and future health costs. But we're still finding this conversation around taxation complicated because the narrative is so complicated. So only experts can really engage around it. So I think in developing an advocacy strategy, we need to ground truth some of these things to make it simpler for other activists to sort of integrate this into their broader advocacy messages. Thank you.
There's just another question on front.
Good morning. Thank you very much for that. Daryl Swanepoel from the Inclusive Society Institute. I would just like to get a little bit of a sense of the reforms that are being proposed. So we know about the strategy and the negotiations and that's, but what are the actual reforms that are being proposed?
Great. Okay. Thank you so much for all of those questions. Yeah, all of them really, really great questions. So I'll sort of go through them each. So the first question around financial resources, and not just financial, technical resources. This is indeed an issue that I think a number of developing countries, particularly smaller countries, are confronted with. One of the things that we've been saying in our engagements with different governments is that particularly for those that are members of the inclusive framework, there are resources that are being set aside by those governments for their participation in those negotiations, right? And so essentially what we're saying is this is a question of shifting resources, right, around from one platform to the next in order to contribute to a platform, right, that could potentially have much more meaningful results for the region. But secondly, one of the advantages of having negotiations at the UN is that ultimately, at the end of the day, you tend to find countries participate and negotiate as blocks. And at the UN, particularly global South countries are in the majority. And so because of that, they can take advantage of each other's various technical capacities. And then what they need to do when they're in, for example, the auditorium, is reflect support for the country that might have been tasked to lead, for example, a certain conversation. And we found this to be effective. And so what it means is that smaller countries are then able to really benefit, right, from the wealth of knowledge that might exist, for example, in another country, but also they can share amongst themselves, right, their different levels of expertise. And we found this, right, because even if you take a look, for those of you who followed the negotiations, the number of countries that are sort of speaking to different issues from the region aren't that many. But essentially, they are coming together, collectively agreeing on positions based off of their different expertise and then supporting each other in that direction. The second question was around... oh, no, there was a second question that I didn't take down.
Second question was about recommendations to civil society. Take it up.
Recommendations to civil society. So the first is one of the other benefits of conversations happening at the UN is that you don't actually have to be in New York to follow the discussions, right? So they actually stream live on UN Web TV, I think that's what it's called, the negotiations themselves. And so you can actually sit and see, number one is your country in the room, right, when negotiations are taking place. And then number two, what are they saying? And so as TGNA, we have a civil society working group that's run by my colleague Evelyn, where we come together to discuss different country positions, what they said in New York, and what that might mean for a strategy at the national level. So specific to South Africa, one of the things we found is that there hasn't been, and this is why I keep saying this, explicit support for the UN Framework Convention. And so when working with our national partners here, one of the things we've said is you need to sort of call them out, right, to do so. And of course, the complexities around why they might not want to reflect full support for that, I think, can be discussed. And, you know, my colleagues are best placed to respond to that. But I think that's one of the things we say to civil society. So follow the negotiations, you can see the positions, and then at national level, hold them to account, right, with regards to what they're saying. Around an advocacy strategy, one of the things that is often said within the tax justice movement is that tax is not just a technical issue, it's a deeply political issue as well. And one of the reasons that's an important statement is because we've found that often there's a form of gatekeeping, rather than the technical experts put in place, right, to prevent sort of the general public, etc., to participate in those negotiations. But you only need to look at last year's protests in Kenya, right, to understand that the general person can fully understand, right, when there's a tax policy that's being put in place that disadvantages them, right? So I think the first point is to note that the average person can actually understand tax policy, right? And then with regards to a strategy, it's important, therefore, to pick on the areas, right, that are easily understandable to then put together that strategy. And we've actually found that it works. One of the things we say within TGNA is that tax justice there's essentially both demand and supply for it, right? So those that supply tax justice, which is sort of equitable tax rules, are, for example, your government through policies, etc. But the public is the one that demands it, right? And you need to essentially have a public participation, right, to essentially ensure that what's being put out there is something that benefits them. I think with regards to the race to the bottom, one of the areas of work that as TGNA we also engage in is a support of regional cooperation. So we recently signed an MOU, for example, with the Africa Union as well as the Africa Tax Administration Forum, because the trade to the bottom question takes place when countries are not talking to each other, when they are competing with each other, right, in order to attract investment. And there's very little to no research that actually shows that when you are decreasing your tax rates or providing incentives, that this in any way has direct influence with direct impact on how much investment you receive. But even if you do think it does, right, to what extent are you doing, for example, tax expenditure analysis, right, to essentially understand the cost benefit? What are you giving up, right, when you let go of certain taxes in order to attract investment? And so these are all conversations that happen at regional level. There needs to be, however, much better cooperation between African countries in order to ensure that this works better. But ultimately, that is something that needs to be addressed, and also an advocacy strategy, I think, that can be developed by civil society to support that. And then lastly, I think the question around Mauritius. Interestingly, as TGNA, we actually took the Kenyan government to court after having signed a double taxation agreement with Mauritius. Number one, we found it problematic as far as the way in which it affected Kenya's domestic resource mobilization efforts, but also secondly, it hadn't gone through the proper channels, right, in terms of public participation, etc. We highly discourage the signing of double taxation agreements with tax havens. And since, for example, our court case, we've seen a number of African countries actually start to cancel their double taxation agreements, largely because of the impacts that it has, right, on their revenue mobilization. So that is something that we always say is important to look out for. But at the end of the day, Mauritius is part of, SADC, it is part of the community. So we do need to figure out the way in which we can engage, again, to my second point, from a regional perspective in a way that's mutually beneficial for all of us.
Thank you. Before I go into another round of questions, we are actually joined by one of our online speakers, Mr. Joel Akator Odigi. I apologize if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. I just want to double check with our IT. Are we able to incorporate or include them into the meeting so we can see them? Thank you so much. Fantastic. So Joel Diggy is the General Secretary for the African Regional Organization of the International Trade Union Confederation, ITUC Africa, representing over 18 million workers in 52 of the 54 African countries. He is a seasoned activist, a staunch Pan-Africanist who rose from the ranks of the trade union in Nigeria, trade union movement in Nigeria. He's also a strong advocate for human and trade union rights, social and economic justice, gender justice, Africa's development, and a fair and just multilateralism. He previously held the position of Deputy General Secretary of ITUC Africa and that of the Human and Trade Union Rights Coordinator of ITUC Africa as well. Sir, are you able to hear us? Can we please ask you to unmute? I think as we wait to be connected, let us please ask the host to drop our speaker a message and let's open up another round of questions. I saw there was in the middle of the room, and while we're still waiting for our second speaker, we'll just engage further. Thanks. Can we have a microphone, please? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. My name is Obekun Daniel. I'm the Regional Secretary for PSI Africa and Arab countries. Most of the time when we talk about cooperation, we tend to look at the countries more, but I think that we also need to look at the civil society organizations and the unions. And I say this because we are not here by chance. We didn't have Nigeria leading the process by chance. I remember from the establishment of the BEPS project to the establishment of the inclusive framework and countries that were asked to sign on, civil society organizations and unions were very vocal about the fact that the OECD does not represent all of us. And most of the time, developing countries are only called on to sign. So we're very vocal about it. Somewhere around 2016, PSI, ITUC Africa, Tax Justice Network Africa were on the street. 2017, we're on the streets of Nigeria, making a lot of noise. And so, in fact, before 2022, Nigeria had in 2016, I think, had made the first resolution on international cooperation in fighting illicit financial flows before 2022. And so the point I'm trying to make is that it's been a build-up of a lot of work. In fact, somewhere in 2017, Nigeria organized, as a country, organized its first international conference on IFFs and asset recovery. By then, there was a huge discussion around Nigeria recovering assets that have been stolen by politicians, especially Abacha, and stored kept in the Switzerlands. So it's been a build-up of a lot of activities and actions, not just meeting in conference rooms, but sometimes on the streets. And the point here is that we must also be clear within our circles what we mean by cooperation, what we mean by collaborating. There are a number of activities we see ourselves do, and we see that would have, made much more impact if we had put the resources together. Of course, I understand the situation with funders and all that, but I think that we must be deliberate about, defining cooperation amongst ourselves, collaboration amongst ourselves, and be clear what is expected of each of us when we meet. And I think that if we lose that, the fact that that is part of the campaign, that is part of the process, that we'll be here discussing other countries, discussing presidents, discussing ministers, but ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm Jenny Ricks from Fight Inequality Alliance, and maybe my question comment builds on nicely from our where our comrade left off. I was thinking, listening to your brilliant analysis tonight, like the construction of that advocacy strategy needs a few layers. So it's probably best for us to think, and people have already mentioned many of them. And I think it's important for us to build the day with that in mind as we hear from different people across the sessions. I was thinking, and people have mentioned this already, that, the way that people are organizing and mobilizing in different countries does have different entry points with why their daily struggles, their daily inequalities need a progressive tax system, need debt cancellation, need a different economic system. And that is going to be how people relate and engage in this campaign, and these campaigns. And otherwise, I think we know, everyone in this room knows that there's that insider and outsider spectrum is needed, right? There's going to be folks who track the policy conversations very closely, who are talking to governments, who are working at that level at the UN. But equally, we also need the people power aspect. And it's our job, when thinking about mobilizations, we're already planning this year, stuff that's happening just before the FFD summit across the global south, mobilizations ahead of the next finance ministers meeting. People are organizing this tax reform demand is one of the major ones, but the entry points for people may be slightly different about the public services they expect to be delivered, the social grants and so on. And so we all know these things. But weaving those different layers together is our role in terms of putting this strategy together. Because it needs to, I'm thinking about the trajectory up to the G20 and how for a lot of people and the things that we're organizing in the run up to November, in and around November, we also have to work at the narrative level where people are able to have a much stronger voice, a grassroots voice about what people want from this next phase, this crisis of multilateralism, what happens in a redesign. It has to be people's expectations setting that agenda, that new blueprint and so on, of which this piece is a critical one, right? And you've also mentioned the debt piece. So I suppose it's as we're plotting out the day for us to think of it in that broader frame, and how we weave the different people in the room are working primarily with different pieces of that puzzle, and that's really exciting. But let's maybe have the conversation and build the strategy in that broader frame. It would be a fantastic opportunity. Thanks.
Just want to check if there's another question. And before we move on to the final hand in the middle here, I just want to check, is Mr. Odigi still with us? Yes, no, a thumbs up from the back? No. Okay, thank you. I think let's take the question in the middle here, and then we can start to wrap up and have a final thought at the same time, perhaps. Yeah.
Thank you, Chennai. I'm Navga Regina. I'm the Tax Equity Manager at IBP. I wanted to find out how we can link the G77 to the G20 discussion. Last year in Uganda, I think we chaired, Uganda was chairing the G77. We were very happy, but as CSOs, we did not get a chance to participate effectively. Right now it's in South Africa. How do we ensure that we actively engage in this space? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for those questions. Well, comments rather. I think Daniel and, and Jenny both gave comments that I think will really help, particularly in the last section of today when we're thinking about the strategy and next steps, etc. But maybe just to comment on their comments. Absolutely, I think, Daniel, a lot of the reform we're seeing at the international really is as a result of a build-up of national level sort of engagement by not just civil society, but the trade union movements, etc. And so, I think it's important, number one, and I think thinking about how best to galvanize that moving forward, I think really is an important piece of the puzzle, because we wouldn't be where we are today with the discussion on a UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation if it wasn't for civil society having been advocating and sort of repeatedly calling for this work, dating back to 2009, as was mentioned by Daniel. And then I think to Jenny's point, absolutely. I think a strategy needs to be developed that's both insider, outsider, and the messaging needs to be clear. And I think for the insider-outsider strategy to work well, there needs to be constant conversation, right, between the two. So, for example, I am aware of sort of conversations that are being held quite consistently now by the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, where there is a process of sort of trying to collectively agree on the messaging that we take, because ultimately we also want to make sure that there is coherence in what it is that we're saying to negotiators inside versus what we're demanding for outside, right? And so I think that piece, I completely agree, is correct. And to your point around the layers, I mean, here we're going to be talking about an African strategy, but these conversations need to happen in other regions too, right? What are our global north partners or civil society groups? What are their demands and how are they holding to account as well? So that's just a comment on that. With regards to G77, G20, so the G77 is a much wider group of global South countries predominantly. At least on the tax piece, there is a coherence with regards to what they're calling for, which is the UN Framework Convention. I know, for example, on the debt piece, there seems to be a little bit of divergence because ultimately, whilst Global South, as I mentioned earlier, they're not homogenous, right? So they all have different sort of asks depending on their economy, size, etc. I think that the best way to engage with the G77 is to, number one, identify who your negotiators are. Like I said, if you're following the discussions, even on UNWebTV, you can see, number one, are they in the room? Number two, what are they saying? So the extent to which you have access to your negotiators in New York, that's entry point number one. But number two, many of these negotiators get instructions from their capitals, right? So even if you can't get to New York, having conversations with your foreign office is also one way, right, that you can see how you can essentially try to influence those negotiations. But each country will look very different depending on capacity, etc. And then I was just informed that there was a question I missed earlier on the earlier round of discussions, which is what are the concrete asks that are currently taking place right now? So at present, there's sort of three pillars of work that are being undertaken as part of the UN Framework Convention. So the first is the negotiations on the agreement itself, right? What is the framework? What is the actual convention going to look like, right? What are the different areas that we want to highlight as important? So when we say, for example, international tax cooperation, someone was asking about definitions. What do we mean, right? When we say, for example, one of the big asks by developing countries is, fair allocation of taxing rights, right? What does that mean, right? So all of these sort of principles and commitments are essentially going to be within that convention that's being negotiated now. And then in addition to that, there's two essentially protocols that are being negotiated that are going to come with the Framework Convention. The first protocol is on cross-border services, Right now, a big issue, right, is how do you tax these big multinational corporations that are making money in our countries but have no presence, right? So there's a big discussion around what does that look like? Do we need to be thinking about withholding tax? Do we need to be thinking about formulary apportionment, etc., right? So that's the first sort of substantive negotiating issue that's being tackled. The second is around dispute resolution, right? So there's a protocol that's being negotiated now to help countries think through how to manage tax disputes, right? And so that's the second sort of technical issue that's being negotiated. So there's those three different work streams. Two of those work streams are being co-chaired by Africans. So I know we've got Nigeria chairing one and Ghana chairing another. So again, that goes to my earlier point, right, about how different countries have different skin in the game in a sense, right? But ultimately, negotiations and conversations need to happen so that there is an African agenda that's being championed collectively. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. And I think as I have the final word, I think what's most interesting in this moment in time is how, as we have grown much more interconnected, the newer driver of these issues is public expectation, which is more perverted in the transactional sense. And it's a very keen moment in which public expectation is exploited to not better understand what are the benefits of progressive tax, perhaps. But I look forward to seeing the outcomes of what an advocacy strategy looks like and seeing how it can be integrated into all layers. For example, your grassroots, your other more research-based organizations, and how others are taking it forward to the so-called quote-unquote upper echelons. I would really like to extend my appreciation to you for being such an unbelievable panelist and sharing your expertise with us today. Thank you so much, Chennai. Thank you, everyone.